Timo Stollenwerk. This is Ramon Navarro Bosch. And that's Nathan van Gheem, remotely from the US. And we are going to talk about possible future path that Plone could take in a more bright future. Eric gave a very good keynote, I think, and we're all really happy with Plone 5. Plone 5 has a mature and secure backend, and we moved towards the right direction, I think, with a more modern front end with pattern libs. But there's a whole new JavaScript world out there. We saw many talks today about JavaScript, about Angular, about Meteor, and other frameworks. And we all know that the JavaScript world is moving really fast. There are not a couple of days where there's no new JavaScript framework coming around. The web is becoming more an application platform, that means that we have a client-server architecture, right? Application code is moving more from the back end, more into the front end, and that means that we have a client-server architecture. And before I move on, here's this big disclaimer sign. This talk is just about the three of us, our personal opinions about what we currently do with Plone, how we could envision the future of Plone. We are all members of different teams in Plone, of the framework team and others, but we're not speaking as framework team members or roadmap team members. It's just about our personal ideas, and we would like to make this talk start a discussion about future directions. So feel free to comment, and we're looking forward to the discussion afterwards. I already talked about the brave new JavaScript world. Why people want that? If you move your application code to the front end, you have a way quicker page load, so you have a better performance. You have more like an app feeling. You don't have to wait until the request comes back. You have modern UI. All the innovation happens currently in the JavaScript world. As a developer, it's really like a JavaScript candy store. You just choose stuff that like shiny new stuff, and you just like take it and you use it, right? And that's pretty attractive because you don't have to build your own stuff. You just reuse what's out there, right? But still, we need with application code moving to the client, we need a client-server architecture, and that problem is not really new. I mean, there have been for ages like middleware components like XML RPC, ZOAP, WSDL, or XML-based solutions, and they were pretty heavy. If you ever worked against a ZOAP service, I know what I'm talking about. And like always in the IT world, if everybody goes into one direction, at some point there's a shift into the other direction. And that shift that we saw from middleware components like XML RPC was to RESTful APIs. I will come to that in a minute and explain what that means. But it's a more lightweight approach, and in the JavaScript world, the language that is used to communicate between the client and server is JSON. There are a few other approaches between like middleware components and REST, which is like WebSockets if you want real-time communication, or GraphQL from Facebook, which was just released. But I'm mainly going to talk about XML RPC and JSON APIs and REST. So how would the most simple JSON RPC API for Plone look like? I mean, Plone has browser views, right? And we can return JSON. So Plone can serve JSON. How would that look like? We would do a post request on an API endpoint, right? That could be like no/API or api.hostname.com, whatever. And we use the post HTTP method because it's like the generic one, right? You use for everything. And then we have a method, right? So the idea is here, we have a single endpoint and we expose our internal API over HTTP. And this create content is a method from Plone API, right? So we could do that. We could just expose this create content, we would have to provide a document type. If we would want to create a document, we have to provide a title and a container, right? That's the same what Plone API does. So we could expose that. But there are a couple of problems with that. For once, since we are using JSON, we don't have any structure, any schema. So it's hard to validate that data, right? We don't have XML where we can have an XML schema and validate that. So it's hard to process and validate. The implementation is also pretty brittle and easy to break, because as soon as we change a detail in this API, we will break all our clients, right? And that's a problem if we are working on Python level, but if we're exposing that on HTTP level, it's even harder, because if we start our instance on Python level, the instance will fail. We will see it immediately. If we just expose our HTTP API, it will break the clients and we won't even notice it, right? So that's a big problem. So that's the lowest level. We have one URL, one service endpoint, and one method. We're just using post for everything. We would use post for creating content, for getting content, for deleting content and updating content, right? Because post is the generic HTTP method. Chris, you're not amused. That's good. So that's basically what Web Service API for Plone does, right? It's a remote procedure call. So we can do better like that. We can do better than that. We can still use the API endpoint, but we can use URLs, right? Plone has nice URLs, right? We don't have those PHP question mark, ID equals, whatever. We have clean URLs. So we can use those URLs, right? And just say, okay, we have now an API call on my folder. We still have this create content method. We have to provide the type and the title, but we don't have to provide the container, right? That's a bit better. We have one method, one HTTP method, but we are using multiple URLs. So we got rid of the container, which is a bit better, but the implementation is still brittle. We can easily break the API. So that's basically what Plone JSON API does. It's limited to get and post, and it exposes the internal API, and it uses, in addition, a method to do URL composition, and it uses Werkzeug for that. So another framework on top of Plone. And we can do better than that, I think. We could use the HTTP methods that the HTTP specification gives us. The idea is that you still have the API call, but you use all the HTTP methods in the HTTP specification, which means that you can do a GET request to get your object, that you can do a POST request with type ID title to create one, that you do a PUT to update the resource, and you do a delete to delete the resource. So you have the entire CRUD cycle. All the examples before, I just showed one example of doing it, right? And there are at least 3 if you go through the CRUD cycle. Here we have them all more compact. So that's what's usually considered to be what people mean if they talk about RESTful APIs. They mean this mapping from CRUD operations to HTTP verbs. So that's the idea. So why are we doing this? What does this give us? REST is kind of like a standard, you could say, in the JavaScript world, or in the world of like middleware components. So if you implement that, other components can understand that. So it's a standard way, and you can decouple your API from your underlying implementation, right? Because you're mapping your CRUD operations to that standard, more or less. So it's a way of decoupling the client from the server. As we all know, Plone was limited or is limited to get and post requests. That's why Plone JSON API uses just get and post. So Ramon and I started to work on a package called Plone REST, which allows us to use all the HTTP verbs on top of Plone. We just released version 1.0 alpha 1, and you can use HTTP verbs on top of Plone. So how does this work? Just as you register a browser view, you can register an HTTP method for an interface, and you provide a factory, which is basically a browser view that returns JSON or any other on any other format. In order to trigger an API call, we could have used a specific view or like a subdomain like API dot whatever, but we choose to use the HTTP header to go with the HTTP standard. So the HTTP standard has a way to that the client can tell the server what kind of format it expects, and that's the accept header. So if you registered a delete view, you can do a delete request on no host my folder and provide the accept header application JSON, and this way you tell the Plone REST that it should use the return the JSON response, right? And the response would be a 210 created, deleted, sorry, so that the client knows that this resource has been deleted. So the good thing if you implement that level of REST is that you have connectors on your favorite front-end framework. If you use Angular, you have REST Angular. If you use React, you have connectors, and Ember or any other framework. Maybe not for jQuery, but all the modern ones. Just an example for Angular, how it works. In Angular, you just have this, you register this resource, this user resource, and you give a user ID, an optional user ID. And this is everything. If the backend implements a RESTful API, then you just have to use those methods and nothing else. You don't have to worry about doing a real delete HTTP request. You just use what's there. So that's good. If we use a standard way of doing that, then it's easy to connect. You can still override things if you want to do it in another way, but this is like an advantage. I talked a lot about REST, and usually if somebody talks about REST, somebody from the audience complains that you forgot about a third thing that's called hypermedia. So REST stands for representational state transfer. Roy Fielding wrote his PhD about that, and it's a software architectural principle and a set of restraints for distributed systems that allow you to write scalable, performant, and simple, modifiable, and readable applications. And if you obey those like principles, you will get certain assets out of that, right? But what people usually forget is this hypermedia constraint. So what's the idea of hypermedia? The idea is Roy Fielding looked at the software architecture of the web and thought about why is this so successful, right? And he applied those principles to this client-server architecture and came up with REST. So why is hypermedia an important part of the systems? All the examples that I gave you until now are easy to break, right? Because as soon as you change like the URL, or if you change a parameter, you will break all your clients. So what a lot of people do is they version their API. That is a problem for a system like Plone, right? Because we could end up with like different versions of an API and maybe have to support many different versions, right? So what we would like to have is an API that is not that easy to break, that decouples the front end from the back end in a way that you can change the API without breaking the clients. And hypermedia is the part that allows you to do that. The idea is that a JavaScript client acts like a human user of a web page. In a web page, you go to like the main page, and then you just follow links. And the client, ideally with a hypermedia API, would do the same. You have an entry point at the beginning, and when you go to the entry point, all the client does is follow links. So if the links change, your API, your client does not break because it just follows links, right? So how do we do that? We have certain standards that we can use, and we used for our proof of concept JSON-LD and Hydra. And if you do a request on, like, say, the portal root or on a folder, you will get a response like that. You will get an ID, which is basically a self-reference. You will get a set of members, if that's a folderish content, right, with links to the members inside that folder, and you will get a set of operations that you can do. So you're not getting like like a list with ID, title, whatever of the members, but you get links. So if you choose to change the links, your API, and you just follow the links, your client will not break. And the same is true for operations. So if you get such a request, and in operations it lists what you can do on that resource, the client can just show that to the user, and the user can just follow those links. So that's a way to decouple the front end from the back end. So that's why hypermedia is attractive, I think. So what's the current status? I already told you that we have an alpha release of Plone REST. So you can build your RESTful API or REST-ish API on top of Plone with the HTTP verbs. And I started to work on Plone REST API, and Ramon continued that work recently. And I think we're on a good way. And Ramon will later also show an example and a demo. And that was my part of the RESTful API. And Ramon and Nathan will now show you things that we could build on top of that RESTful API. And at the end, Ramon will show a demo. And
thank you, Timo. The main idea of this talk was to try to introduce some ideas we had to reduce the amount of code that we have on Plone, because there is a lot of things that we're maintaining, and we are adding layers. Every Plone conference, there is a new layer on Plone. So if we continue like that, we'll have a lot of layers in 30 years. So one of the things that we propose is the API, the REST API that will allow us to do a lot of things on the browser. And Nathan is going to talk more about that. But I'm introducing more delicate step. It's the pluggable authentication service. And I'm going to go really fast, but just if we want to split the Plone in different, in a front end in JavaScript and in a back end in Plone, and we want to use Elasticsearch, Solar, or whatever that a lot of us are using on our production sites, we have a problem about the users, the identification of the users, because Plone is a bottleneck for that. In the most of my site, I'm using LDAP, and it's a crap. I don't know how many of you have LDAP on your Plone sites, but it goes slow. It gets really difficult to get it running really fast. And when you go inside Plone authentication service, Plone Pass, LDAP multi-plugin, LDAP user folder, I can add more packages there, but it gets completely messy. And I try to understand what's doing. So I went to it and I saw, okay, I don't know if it's really simple. I know most of you will already know. Pluggable authentication service just gets the user, looks which groups it has, looks which global roles it has, this user, looks which local roles it has in the context, and it has a list of roles for this context. Okay, me, I'm editor on this context. And then there is the permissions and the workflows that sets to edit, I need one of these roles, and just checks if one of your roles is on the list of the permissions, on the roles that you have permissions to do. This approach, I was looking at that and was thinking, so it's simple, so why is it so complex? Why is it so slow? Why is it not working fine? And most of that it was like, okay, what happens with an LDAP with lots of users? Oh, it gets really bad. With groups, recursive groups, it gets messy. A lot of queries to LDAP, strange queries that shouldn't be done there. So, and managing users. When we have LDAP, normally we don't have the editor of users of Plone. It's not the best fit for managing that users, because if you have 300,000 users, I assure you that it's not working, the editor of users of LDAP. So my proposal here, and later I will try to explain you, is okay, create some kind of external extensible service, cool name, for something that's so easy. I'm the user, this context, give me the roles of this user on this context. So what we are working on, and if anybody's interested on that, is removing all the pluggable authentication service that try to get this information and put outside of Plone. So there is no groups, no local roles stored on the object, nothing. Just everything, all the information is stored on an external service in an API or whatever that you need to have that information. Then what's the good thing for us of this idea is that if we have that, then we can plug Elasticsearch to know the permissions of each of the documents of the Elasticsearch to this service. We can have any other thing that we have, the front end. We will not need to ask to Plone if this user has permissions to do that or the list of the users. So my proposal is to remove some of the part, or at least to split some of the parts of the pluggable authentication service outside of Plone. We already have a working implementation that it's relying on LDAP and Docker. And it really goes much faster than the one that we have in Plone right now. And it's just an idea for us. It's working really fine. And if anybody is interested on trying to push on that direction in Plone, I'm not saying that we should remove Plone pluggable authentication service, because for an out-of-the-box Plone is completely great as it is now. If you have 3 users or some users, it's great. I'm just saying that for some kind of installations that we need hundreds of thousands of users, then it's a good idea. And if you need to decouple also the Elasticsearch security outside of Plone, you also need that kind of solutions. So the information about security, it's outside of Plone. And after this security Plone stuff, it's time of Nathan. Nathan, are you here? So I'm going
Hello,
to...
everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we hear you. Let me just turn
All right.
a bit.
So I don't see my own slides. I have slides here, but hopefully I can keep them in sync.
I will turn for you.
All right. And I hear an echo of myself, so this should be fine. Okay, so if we're going to be moving to just a REST API in JavaScript front end, then we're no longer rendering HTML with Plone or Python or page templates or the traditional ways of doing things. So page rendering, I'm going to talk about page rendering and what it will look like in this sort of context of the new JavaScript world. And by page rendering, I mean a user requests a URL, and we turn that URL into an HTML response. Right now in Plone, it's all done in Python. You take a request object, context, so like a certain document, and various other configuration on the site, and render an HTML response. Much of the time, Plone takes in processing the request is rendering in the page templates, and the reason why this HTML output is strongly coupled with the CMS, because you have forms, you have things that require hosting to modify data. And the current state at which, the current way in which Plone does rendering of HTML is you have the publisher or Zope deciding which object or view it's going to call to get the HTML output. That will usually render a response, which is an HTML page that is chameleon, that has macros, portlets, and all kinds of other stuff that takes the HTML or the configuration bits and the settings on the site and the saved field data and outputs HTML. And then in addition to that, we have transformations that take the Dazo theme and map the content into the Dazo theme. And then we have mosaic transformation, which will take the tiles and render the tile information. And then finally it gets to the browser. And then you have the browser interpreting the HTML with CSS defining what the HTML looks like, and then JavaScript doing additional transformations at the end. And for templating, Plone uses Chameleon for generating HTML. There are many, so what it would look like with JavaScript is we'd switch to a JavaScript templating engine. There are lots to choose from. Angular has their own, most of the major frameworks have their own, and then rendering moves out of Plone and it's faster. Vlets and portlets would probably no longer be necessary. Those would become like HTML components. And those would be defined in your web application theme. Theming in Diazo is much more difficult to see what it would look like. But in theory, if you liked the Diazo approach, you could still do it. The original Diazo approach years ago had a browser transformation alternative where you could actually do the transformation in the browser. And XSLT, there used to be browser support for actual doing XSLT in the browser, but there's also JavaScript implementations of XSLT if you just want to use that transformation. But Diazo might be unnecessary because HTML rendering is now decoupled from the CMS, because you're not like dependent. Plone would no longer be dependent on forms to do stuff. You don't care about which form library Plone uses. Plone wouldn't necessarily have a form library. It'd have a defined schema, and the web application would decide what forms to use to update the CMS with the REST API. And then what would Mosaic look like? So Mosaic is taking tiles, which are bits of configuration, and rendering them on a page. And the editor for Mosaic is already JavaScript. In theory, this could all pretty much stay the same. The storage can stay the same. The rendering would be moved from Python Chameleon templating to JavaScript templating. That would be the only change. So in the end, what you have for page rendering is with JavaScript and REST API is Plone maps the URL to a REST method. You get a JSON response of all the data and information you need. And then the browser uses JavaScript to render the output of the HTML page. And you have additional JavaScript binding probably on that output, and then CSS. So you're moving a lot of the processing over to the browser. The Plone, the CMS just cares about giving you a decent API and JSON response. And finally, how might it work? Well, you have a Plone server running the REST API. You have a static HTML5 web application that is hooked up with that Plone server's endpoint. And JavaScript handles all the page rendering of the REST API. And then what kind of problems does this bring along? Well, it's unclear what the theming would look like, as I kind of discussed. It gets there probably are a lot of ideas of how you could do it, or you could mimic current Diazo implementations or current Mosaic layout type implementations in JavaScript, but it's still unclear. And then if you're going all JavaScript, the first page load does not include any HTML. So how do search engines index your site? Well, Google is getting better at this, but it's not great. And anything like this would be sort of with the understanding that this is like a 5-year sort of idea, where by the time you get a full CMS to this point, then search engines are better at this maybe. But if you have to, you can potentially render the initial page load with Node.js or using Angular or React. You'd have to run another process to do it, but there are people who do this sort of thing, or they'll do a V8 Chrome engine within Python that actually does the JavaScript rendering in Python. It's really weird, but some people do that too. and then search engines can be able to index your site. And I think that's all I kind of wanted to go over. So, Ramon?
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, to wrap up things a bit before Ramon will show his demo. We showed how like a RESTful API could look like, and we already put effort into it. So we have a working proof of concept. And Ramon showed how authentication could look like on top of that. Nathan showed how Mosaic could look like that, could look on top of that. But of course, there are further topics that we need to keep in mind. For instance, forms. There are like many JavaScript, pure JavaScript form frameworks out there. We could imagine that that the backend provides a JSON schema, like SOAP schema. It's like SOAP schema, but in JSON, and that form frameworks take that and create forms and widgets. And the nice thing is that you can override your widget with JavaScript, right? You can just use what the server gives you, and it will render a nice form representation, but you can customize it still in JavaScript without having to know much about your backend. You just need to know about this front end form library. Another topic is Z-catalog or search. Many people these days use Solr or Elasticsearch. Nathan works with Elasticsearch, for instance. I started to build a JSON API for collective Solr so that you can build any front end on top of that, and it works really well for us, at least. Then we have Diazo. Nathan already mentioned that. The question is, will we still need that in the future? We could. But since you can just customize it on the client, it's also really easy you will with this web component idea, or with how React does it, or also Angular directives, you have reusable components on the front end which you can customize, right? So you can just reuse stuff and apply another theme. So Diazo might not be necessary. Yeah, then dexterity. Dexterity will most likely stay because we will still need content types. That's another discussion, right? But if we have dexterity types, we have a schema, and we can expose that schema through the RESTful API. Then another important topic is hackability, of course, how we allow people without really deep knowledge of the stack to work with Plone and do a lot of things. So we have to keep that in mind. And now Ramon will do the presentation, the demo.
See. Just a really short demo. This is a Plone site that has Mosaic, Mosaic installed. You can see there is the front page, and let me see if it's open. Yeah, and a tile, a normal tile here, and here there is an Angular. So on Monday it was looking better, but I'm using Angular 2. And they released yesterday 2 versions of Angular 2, so it broke everything now. At least I could manage today to at least.
You should stay with boring technology.
Yeah, I cannot do that. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So it's really small. Yeah. Let me just reload it. So what I'm getting here, sorry, the debugs. Yeah. So what I'm getting here, I don't know if you're going to see it. Let me see. Where is it? Yeah, this one. So yeah, at least something. So this is the Plone REST API answer. If we just if I try to get this URL from my browser, I'm getting the web page. But if I'm trying to get the same URL here, I'm getting the JSON representation, because I have this Plone REST that in case that I add this header, it's called accept application JSON. It returns me the the JSON information about the content. Here we have the martializing of the content. And as I am adding the frame interaction, I'm also getting the possible actions I have with my user. So the object action, the portal tabs, blah, blah, blah. What I'm getting here, it's important, it's the content. The content is the layout from Plone Mosaic. It's where it's stored, how are you going to see the content on your side when you're going to render that. So what I'm doing, it's getting this layout that's, I don't know if you know, I don't know how to say it. Here, maybe. Well, I don't know if you ever saw how Mosaic is storing things, but it just stores data grid. It's a row. So then you will need to replace that with your CSS framework class. And then you have this data grid, it's on the left, or data tile with, okay, yeah, here. Here I'm saying data tile, this is the tile I want to render here. So what this is a proof of concept, just implemented the Plone blocks rendering engine in JavaScript. So it just gets this information and it just merge everything. So I have my Plone site here. Well, it's not 100% working, we should be upper, but it's rendering the Plone blocks mosaic on JavaScript. So I'm just getting the JavaScript. And this is just a proof of concept of the ideas. There is also this authentication outside, but we don't have time to show now. But the idea is we are using Plone Mosaic to store the layout, the template of the content on the content. We are getting on the browser, and it's the browser who's rendering that. We are using Angular to this proof of concept because supports server-side rendering, so we have option to get the page already compiled. And yeah, we should change to the last
one. Yeah, so as I said before, that's just our a lot of things that we show are that we showed are work in progress, and we're still discussing a lot of ideas, and we're not saying that this is how Plone 6s looks like or anything. It's just that we all have certain projects, and we want to work with shiny new JavaScript front ends, and that requires a few changes on or not changes, but a few additions on the back end, and the way how we implemented Plone REST and Plone REST API is not interfering in any way with Plone. They're both add-on products that you can just install, and they will work with your existing Plone site. They will not break anything. It will allow people to actually use modern JavaScript front ends if they want to do that with Plone. So if you have project with React, with Angular 1, with Angular 2, with Ember, with whatever, please have a look at what we did and consider contributing to that. We're happy to listen to requirements that other people have. Right now we are just working on the stuff that we need to proceed. Yeah, this is it. We would like to have a discussion on that. So any questions? Did we scare you that much?
So in JC's talk earlier, when he was talking about patterns lib and sort of nice, safe degradation of a site for people that don't like to use JavaScript, especially considering sort of the wars and battles that are beginning to rage over ads services and trackers and so on and so forth. Do we really want to push far and fast down this road of creating completely separate JavaScript front ends for sites? Or it seems to me that this is a discussion that we might want to have. I also know that, you know, in teaching Python, I get an opportunity to sit still for a while and work with the same material over and over again and perfect it, whereas I know that my colleagues who teach JavaScript front end or even full stack JavaScript are constantly rewriting their material because the world over there is moving so fast and so chaotically that it makes it very hard to target anything that you can rely on still being there in a year. So where is that discussion at?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, we're having this discussion constantly over and over again, and we are still exploring. Like, at last Plone conference, I gave a talk about like React 1.3, right? And now there's React Angular 1.3, and now there's Angular 2, which is a completely different framework. I mean, React is there, other frameworks are there, so it's a moving target. And it's hard to choose for every new project that I had. I had a project like 1.5 years ago. I made a decision. I was like happy with it. If I would have to make a decision today, it might be a different decisions. Depending on if it's like a public website, then I might want to go with React because I'm concerned about first page rendering time, right? If it's like an internet application, I might go with Angular 2 or Angular 1.3. So that's not an easy decision, and it's not an easy decision for us as a community. And I think it's important for us to understand that we're not, our idea is not that we sit together, even as the entire community, and decide on a framework, and we say, we have this pillow fight, right? And we say, hey, React, no, Angular. And we're not going to have that. I mean, what we want to have is we will provide this RESTful API because that's like the common ground of the frameworks, and then people can start to implement stuff, right? So if Ramon has a project and he chooses Angular 2, he can like create stuff on top of that, right? I did that 1.5 years ago for Angular 1.3. Maybe somebody else steps up and does that for React. And then we'll see how it works for us, how it works for the different use cases. And for a certain period of time, I could imagine that this runs in parallel, that maybe we will do another Plone 6 release, which does not run completely on this Plone REST API, right? We don't know, but it's important for us that we allow people to do that. And regarding the degradation and like JavaScript, that's also something that's hard to tackle, because if you choose Angular 2, for instance, then like you need at least IE 9 or 10 even, something like that, right? But the same is true for Bootstrap, for instance, right? So we have to take care of what we choose, and that we make conscious decisions about that, and that we discuss this in the Plone community. But I don't think that this is something that we have to decide like in the next month or anything. I mean, the great thing about Plone is that's a bureaucracy, right? And people will start to implement something, and then people will jump on that, and we'll see whatever framework will succeed. And Rob already volunteered that he will write a new front end in React. So if he does that, we'll go with React, whatever. I mean, we'll see, right? But I think we solved those kind of problems in the past, and I'm pretty sure we will solve that problem as well in a good way.
I just want to say one thing. You have to be clear. The web isn't really ready for CMS that is only built off of a REST API right now. Anyways, this is years down the road that we're thinking about, and we're not. At least I'm pretty sure all of the guys, Timo and Ramon, would agree with me that we're not completely certain what the web will look like the years coming. But we have a good idea, and we think this is where it's going. But we'll see.
Just wanted to say I'm super excited about this because it opens up so many opportunities. Hello? Because in addition to what I can do now with a server round trip, I will be able to also build an application with Plone as a backend, and I can even have a classical Plone interface for a certain target group like editors or something, and then serve an application to end users with a complete JavaScript front end, and suddenly we heard in the keynote this morning, Plone is back with vengeance. If Plone 6 supports that REST API, I mean, we can play basically everywhere.
And the good thing that the REST API, I mean, Plone REST works with Plone 4 and Plone 5, because I'm working on Plone 4 and Ramon is working on Plone 5. So we'll always test both of them, and the same is true for Plone REST API. So it's not a matter, we don't have to wait for Plone 6 to make it happen. It will work on Plone 4.
Actually, I think it's a pretty good idea to have a REST API for Plone, but taking a look at the history, what happened between Plone 2.5 and Plone 5 now is that we rewrote almost everything, and between Plone 4 and Plone 5 there is not much compatibility any longer. And I don't think it's a good idea to hook up this JavaScript mania with today's framework is good, but tomorrow's is better. And I think we need to stick a little bit with what we have. And if we say Plone 6 is a complete UI rewrite, then I'm wondering what's the switch to Z3C form was good for. Then I'm wondering what all these things the last years happened. In my opinion, it was too much at all, even between Plone 4 and Plone 5. And I think we need to be careful in order not to lose more users. So this is my objection on all this topic. And so I think we should finalize what we have and not start again something new.
One of the things that we are trying to do is not breaking anything. So Plone 6, as I see, there's going to be a lot of Plone 6. A lot of different front end, or Plone 6 or Persemo or whatever. It's different front ends that does different small client applications, like Alex said. If you want something that's only managing pages, because you have a blog page, blog application, then you have your front end, that's the blog page. But all we have right now, we don't need to lose that. We really have a good front end, we studied, we can improve that front end that's rendered with browser views, and it's great for a lot of use cases. We are not saying that we shouldn't continue the path that we are doing. Just we're saying that with Plone REST API, we're not breaking anything, and we are adding the option to have different small applications on top of Plone.
I want to stress that it's not only that. I don't think Plone itself will be the main user of the REST API. Having a solid REST, especially hypermedia REST API, allows any other applications and services that can plug into a REST API use Plone. So our playability in a ecosystem is we're the good guy now on the block because everybody can talk to us if we have that. And the Plone UI on top of that, that is a different thing. That's maybe your motivation. I'm looking from the other side, and that's actually, I think that might be more interesting or also very interesting. And just want to mention that.
Just maybe an observation, but if I look at what a lot of certainly our clients are doing now, I think the model of sort of the one CMS that runs your entire website is becoming less important because people's expectations of what the internet should do, about what you do on the web, what you do on mobile. We might have some stuff on native apps, we might have some stuff on mobile web. It's getting a lot more complex. People are doing a lot more stuff with digital in general. So what that means to a lot of clients, I think, is they might have something like they might buy an e-commerce system and they want that to kind of use to sell stuff, and they might have a CMS that's managing lots of content that's static and some content that's pulled in dynamically, and they might have some custom apps that the users use, and they might have a native mobile front end for certain people and a Salesforce integration and sort of 100 different things. In that world, the two things that I think differentiates the sort of CMS players, and there are no good commercial products that do this well, so Plone has a really important part to play here. Number one is kind of end user usability. So the act of managing content, in stuff like Mosaic, for example, even like 7 years hence, no one has really beaten us to that particular point. So that's really important. The second thing that really matters is integratability. And I think like a well-designed API is incredibly hard. Like something that is obvious and easy and intuitive to use is incredibly difficult. And if we get it right, it's a really good differentiator because it makes the developer experience really nice and easy. And the third thing where I think we will never really win is in maintainability. So it is, it would be easier in that sense if Plone ran on Java because operations departments in big organizations know how to run Java apps, but we shouldn't worry about that because frankly, we've kind of ship has sailed and it's no longer so hard because people are getting more used to doing things that are they're heterogeneous anyway. So I think there's lots of cool stuff we can do for Plone, but I think to kind of echo Philip's point, if we can design the API to be really good, like really, really intuitive, really, really consistent, really, really well documented, that to me is one of the things that will make Plone really successful. So well done. I think it's a really cool thing to do.